Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to IK's Tech Talks. This is Ryan here, and this week we're diving into synthesis. We're mainly going to be using the Memory V, Syntronik, SampleTank 4, and the UNO Synth and UNO Synth Pro as examples today, but this is going to go over for pretty much any synthesizer that you use, whether it's a VST, it's an analog synth, or anything like that. So make sure you guys have an IK username. We're going to be giving away 100 gear credits at the very end. It's going to let you expand on your library inside of SampleTank 4, inside of Syntronik, or even Amplitude or T-Rex if you're not too big of a synth guy. Now, if you're not too big of a synth guy, this is going to be a good intro to help you kind of get into sound design and really creating your own sound. So let's dive right into the synth here, and let's start with Syntronik and some basic terms. Okay, so let's get started on our oscillator section. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but essentially an oscillator is something that's going to go back and forth. Typically, it goes back from a positive voltage 1 to a minus voltage 1, and that's going to generate either a sound or do something for us. So realistically, the oscillator in Syntronik is going to be playing a sampled sound, which in this case, as explained, we're going to be using a square wave here. So this is a square wave, and if you use, again, the search term 1os, you'll see you have the saw wave, and you have the very basic stuff that we sampled. We also sampled some very intense presets, which is really cool, so you can kind of get the analog sound of all these different synthesizers. Now, if you're looking for just a raw basic waveform, you also have something like the UNO Synth Pro, which is like an analog synthesizer. And you can create different waveforms from sine waves to square waves to triangle waves, sawtooth waves, and stuff like that. And if you don't know what I mean by that, if you look on screen to our LFO section, you can see there's a sine wave here. You have a triangle wave, square wave, sawtooth, and random. And those are going to be the way that the simple waveforms make the sound. So let's listen to what a square wave sounds like on Syntronik. Just very basic square, right? Now, picture what that looks like on the grid. It's a sine wave, but it's going over on both sides, so it's getting chopped off a little bit. Now, if you wanted to create a sine wave from a square wave, you could just roll off a low-pass filter a little bit, and it's going to chop off some of those harmonics and smooth it out, making more of a smooth sound. Now, typically, you're going to use this section, the oscillator section, to really define what your sound is going to be. When you're using analog stuff, you have simple waveforms, and then when you use some more digital stuff, most of the time you have complex waveforms. Like if you use massive and stuff like that, you start to get into these really crazy waves that they make. But with the Memory V, we stuck with the sounds that you can create with this analog synthesizer. So the controller section goes hand in hand with the oscillator. So I'm going to knock that out at the same time here. And if you notice, there's poly, mono, legato 1, legato 2. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, poly means you can play multiple notes at once and it's going to play a chord. Mono is only going to play one note at a time. And legato is going to switch between your notes with a slide kind of function, like a glide versus just from one note directly to the next. Legato just meaning the musical term where we're just going to go from one to the other kind of smoothly. So let's hear what those sound like. We have mono. Notice I didn't even have to pick my finger up. It's just going to slide between them. Then we have poly. Let's make a chord. You can hear all of those voices together. And then legato. Let's turn our glide time up to like 1 second. So it's going to take 1 second to get from my first note to my second note. So let's go up 1 octave. So that's the glide time of 1 second with legato 1, and legato 2 is just a different curve to get to that same spot. Now, you can also control your oscillator in different ways with the pitch bend and the vibrato, which are just going to be the controllers that you're used to seeing, on most MIDI controllers and stuff like that. Typically, you'll have them on synthesizers as well, and they're routed to these different things. With different synthesizers like the UNO Synth Pro, you have a modulation matrix where you can route those different functions to different parts of your synth. So you don't necessarily need to use the mod wheel to control a vibrato kind of control, which you could see it's set up by default here. But that's just essentially the oscillator section and the controller section and how that's all going to work together. Let's go ahead and hear the UNO Synth morph between these oscillators, because I want to let you guys get a little bit more about what you're going to use each oscillator for, because again, these are simple waves, but sound design is really important. So we're going to start with a very basic, the UNO Synth Pro wave, and it's just going to be the triangle. So let's go ahead and hear that. And now remember, I've turned off the cutoff here. So I've just morphed from a triangle all the way to a square, and you notice in the middle there, there is a sawtooth wave, which is actually really cool in the fact of, think about like a square wave you'd probably use for brass instruments. You'd probably use that for a more exaggerated, loud clipping kind of sound. Then you'd use a triangle for more of a woodwind instrument, maybe say a flute, something more, I wouldn't say smooth, because a sine wave is going to be the most smooth. Think about that like a sub bass sound. Typically, you might explain a higher sine wave as a whistle, just a very basic, smooth waveform, nothing too harsh. Then we'll go with the sawtooth as kind of like a string bow. Think about the action, the physics of a string. I've seen people try to tie those together, how they physically go together. So that'll give you some basics on what these waveforms do. So let's hear the UNO Synth Pro morph between them. Remember, there's no effects or anything. This is just one oscillator on the UNO Synth Pro. We're not going through all the 3 oscillators that we have here, or the noise oscillator and all the different stuff that we have. So let's just hear what it sounds like when you morph between these, and take a look at the screen so you could see what sounds I'm producing at that time. Now, if you notice, when I get to the square, it starts to get to a square that starts at different points. And that's what you start to use pulse with modulation. And it can kind of make one sound like 2 sounds because of the way that they interact with each other. So it's very cool. This is just a small example of the UNO Synth Pro. Again, we're getting into synthesis, not exactly the UNO Synth Pro. But this is how it works with the Memory V. This is how it works with different sounds in Syntronik. Syntronik, SampleTank 4, anything like that. Even if you mess with Massive, you're going to use these terms, and it's going to kind of give you a better basic building block to start your sounds. So let's go ahead and jump into that next section, which is going to kind of be, if the oscillator is the heart, we'll go to the filter section, which is the soul of the synthesizer. And remember, guys, if you haven't already, like and subscribe, and get ready for the giveaway. We're going to be doing it in just a moment. We're going to be giving away 100 gear credits for you to expand your either SampleTank, T-Rax, or Amplitude collections. Check out the custom shop. We have a bunch of videos on it if you don't know what I'm talking about. But let's jump into this next section, the filter section. We're going to use SampleTank 4 to do that. So let's pull that up here. Okay, so now that we're in SampleTank 4, we're going to take a look at our square wave 1 oscillator from Memory V. And remember, you have the same kind of filter section where you can search through your different sounds. You can select the Memory V here, which I have. And I searched up here, OS1, the same kind of way that I did before. You can see all the different options that you have. So let's go ahead and close that out. And we're going to go to our edit page, which is down here. And we're going to look at our different sections. Notice I have a filter that's off right now. And the reason for that is because I wanted to show you how this affects the sound. Now, remember, this is, if you don't know how a filter works, it's very important because they started out as just resistor capacitor filters, which were very basic. And then Moog kind of revolutionized the entire thing by bringing in the ladder filter, which is a very musical sound. And then, everybody kind of expanded from there. And you have a bunch of different kinds of filters. And that's what we tried to emulate here, was all the different kinds of filters that have evolved through the years that have become kind of staples in creating synthesizer sounds. So we have the M type, think Moog, Roland, which would be R, C, which think the Curtis filter chip. Then we have O, Oberheim, and we have Phaser, Formant, which, if you're not familiar with Phaser, you should definitely check out some effects because you're missing out. Phaser is a great effect style sound. Think of like a lightsaber. Maybe that's a bad example because of the way the classic lightsabers were made. I'm sure you guys in the chat are jumping on that. But the Formant, think about that more of like a classic vowel sound of when we speak. Then we have classic, which is just going to be a classic filter. Now, if we go to, say, the Moog type ladder filter, you're going to see a bunch of different options here. Let's go ahead and see what those sound like when I roll those off. Notice that we have low pass, band pass, high pass, peak, and notch. Now, typically you wouldn't have peak and notch in all of your different filters, but we've kind of made some different advances in SampleTank to see how things would sound. Now, a Moog filter, you're probably expecting a slope of 24. So let's hear what that sounds like on a square wave. So you can see all I did right there. And sorry, you can see my filter is actually connected to my envelope 2 here. So let's turn that to 0 so that way nothing affects my filter. You can double click here if you'd like, and you can just press 0. Bam, we're done. And then we can go to band pass, which is only going to let a certain band of frequencies pass. Let's hear what that sounds when we change the cutoff frequency. And if you don't know what I mean by cutoff frequency, that's going to be the frequency at which the filter starts. And that can mean either the lows pass, a band of frequencies pass, the highs pass, and we'll get to the other two. So notice there's not as much sound here. You guys probably aren't hearing too much, but notice it's only because we're cutting out a lot of different frequencies. And if you have a resonance knob, you can see that the resonance builds on a certain frequency that you've picked. So at 2.2 kilohertz, that's where that is rising. Now, a general rule is you probably sweep to find the frequency you want with the Q high, and you'll turn the resonance low. Sorry, resonance and Q are very interchangeable. I just naturally interchange them. So let's hear what a slightly high Q sounds like. It's going to be a little bit harsher than a lower, more mild Q. So it's much easier to tell what frequency the cutoff is on. Right? So then we have high pass, which you can tell is obviously the opposite of low pass. It only lets the highs pass. Think of something like an old radio that doesn't quite have bass frequencies, so you kind of roll those off just due to the natural size of the speakers. Don't let that comment fool you, because we have some very small iLoud micro monitors and MTMs that are huge sounding, and they definitely don't roll off like that. But give that as an example. Think of, a tiny little Bluetooth speaker. Tiny Bluetooth speaker. We also have the iLoud Bluetooth speaker, which sounds insanely bass heavy for what it is. Now, let's go ahead and check out these next ones. Peak and you're going to have notch. You're not going to actually have those in Syntronik, so we're going to mainly avoid them, but you're not also going to have them in these different filter types. So that's not a huge thing where you're going to need to know it when it comes to synthesis. Look at Classic. It doesn't even have that option. But if you are in one of those and you have a notch, you're going to cut out a notch of frequencies, right? So you can see that's where I'm cutting out, is where that frequency is. And peak, notice it just hits a peak, and you can kind of move that around. Didn't dive into those as much as I dove into the other guys, because those are more important. And the way that we began building those was from resistors and capacitors and putting them in different, parallel or series and stuff like that. And then we have Moog, who revolutionized it with the ladder filter. And then you have Roland, which has all their crazy filters. And really, filters give the soul to a lot of analog synthesizers, where their oscillators were just simple waveforms. When you start getting into complex waveforms, you start getting into more crazy stuff where the filter isn't quite, the most important thing. But when you have a simple waveform, a filter to me is the most crucial thing to affect the sound outside of, say, the envelope, which is what we're going to get into in this next section. So let's go ahead and let's dive past our filters here. And let's double check that we got everything. Oh, we also have slope here. If you guys don't know what slope is going to be how hard this slope hits. Now, this is a 12 dB slope, then you have a 24 dB slope. Obviously, more frequencies pass through at 12 than 24. And you can see that on the reverse. If we go to a multi-mode filter, that term multi-mode means it just has multiple modes that you can use. The Roland type does not have that option here, neither does the Curtis, but the Moog does. Or sorry, did I say that? Roland type does not, the Curtis does not, the Moog does. So high pass, you can see the slope is just 6. That depends on the physical components of the chip. Or if it's not a chip. Most of these are VCFs that we've modeled, voltage controlled filters. That's how most of the analog stuff goes, because that's how you were going to control it on the synthesizer, with voltage. Now low pass, you can see all of these different, just barely rolling off kind of hard, slightly hard, and this is essentially thought of as a very hard slope, 24 dB. That's the hardest one that you see here. Then you might notice we did go over res, but drive. Why is drive there? Now, back in the day, synthesizers were cutting out frequencies, but you weren't compensating in any way, so you needed something like drive to push the frequencies that you were sending through up, and that's what that drive is for. So I think that's about it for the filter section. We've covered all the modes, the slopes, the filter types, why they're there, how you're going to use them, just a little bit. Just think of them as flavors, but they all have different modes, which are the most important parts. But yeah, and you can control this filter with an envelope, which is what we're going to get to next. So let's go ahead and dive into this next section, which we're also going to do in SampleTank, so it should be easy to dive right back into. So let's take a look here. Okay, so as I said, we're going to cover this next section in SampleTank 4 as well, so it'll be easy to just jump right into. So we're going to actually look at our envelopes. We're going to look at our ADSR. If you don't know what that means, attack, decay, sustain, release. Notice we also have a hold here, which is pretty interesting. You don't always have that option, but if you notice on our synthesizer here, you also have that in our filter and our amp section. You have ADSR right on the face. Now that's one of your crucial building blocks to what you're going to do with your oscillators. Now amplitude envelope is crucial in the fact of, actually that's what our envelope 1 is doing here. Now we're going to take a look at memory V here. If you look at it, you're going to see that we have our amplitude and our filter envelope, and those are the most important sections, just like on our analog synth here. But in SampleTank 4, you can customize those to go to pretty much anything you want using the modulation matrix and stuff like that. But we're going to set envelope 1 to our ADSR for amplitude. So notice we have our basic square wave. Let's go ahead and go through all of these knobs and explain what they do. Now, if you notice, we're going to have a couple that are affecting the sound when we press our key, and one that's going to affect it when we release our key. So when we press the key, the attack is how fast it gets to our maximum amplitude. Now it's also going to be the same thing for our filter. It's going to be how fast it gets to our maximum cutoff frequency, right? So that's going to be the cutoff that you set in your filter section. So let's listen to how the attack sounds. Think about if you were to take a violin bow, and I want to slowly increase the amplitude for 1 second. That's what we're going to do here. I set it to 1 second attack time. And that's the coolest part about SampleTank, is that it shows you on screen exactly what's going on. So 1 second it takes to get to that full amplitude. You can take 2 seconds and watch it on screen happen, or you can have it immediately pop in. Right? Now that's similar if you're messing with compression and stuff like that. Attack time is kind of when it kicks in. But this is going to be when it hits that maximum amplitude. So the next thing we have is the hold volume. So let's check out what it sounds like if we put everything to 0 and we just hit our hold. Notice it held the note for 1 second before it went to our decay time. So let's actually hold it for 2 seconds. Let's hear what it sounds like. And it took 0 milliseconds to get to that full maximum amplitude, and then it held it for 2 seconds. Right? That kind of makes some sense when you say it that way. Now, if you bring up your decay, we're going to allow that sound to decay for 1 second. So it's going to take 0 seconds to get to our maximum amplitude. It's going to hold for 2 seconds, and then it's going to decay for 1 second. And this is all while I'm holding the note. So if you notice, the next one is sustain. Now think about, I'm going over all of this, but this is the same thing for filter and amplitude. ADSR is the exact same thing. It's just the graph where everything is being affected. Now this is the amplitude again. We're not going over the cutoff frequency like we would with our filter, which you can do some really cool stuff with. So let's hear that one more time, but we're going to actually change our sustain, which notice it's not a time value. It's actually a level value. This is going to be the level that the amplitude that our note sustains at when we hold a key. So let's hear it at 0. It goes back and sustains at 0. It sustains at -100. So if I drag this up, let's go up to 0. So it's going to stay at 0 when it gets to that time. Let's actually have it take no time to decay there. We'll actually not have it hold at all. We're just going to have it sustain at 0 when it gets there. Now, if I release my note, it's gone, right? There's no hold, there's no decay, there's almost no real life to the sound. It's just sustaining at a certain volume, right? Now we're going to let it release for 1 second. And notice when I let go of the key, it's going to play back and get to the minimum amplitude with 1 second of release time. And you can watch that graph go down. Now maybe this might be better if I exaggerate it to say 6 seconds or something more extreme. Notice the sound just fades out. Now you might not hear too much because we're kind of cutting a lot of the sound out. In SampleTank 4, you can always command or control click if you're on Windows and go back to the basic ADSR. That's the basic ADSR in SampleTank. I like to put this at 0 and then probably have these guys face a little bit like that. Maybe Maybe even have him sustain a little bit more. Now, it depends on what sound you're going for, because if you want to have a sub bass that you just tap for a second, it releases for a really long time, you can do that by just turning the release up and tapping your note. Now, those kind of rules really depend on what you're going for in all of these different situations. And you can assign those same controls to amplitude or filter. So the next thing I want to do is go over our filter envelope, but we're going to go back to the memory V. So let's jump into that real quick. We're going to switch our track over. So now you can see I have my memory V up here, and we have the filter envelope and we have the amplitude envelope. And they're very similar in the sense that we have attack, hold, decay, sustain, release, but we also have two extra knobs here, amount and velocity. So the velocity is going to be the amount that the velocity affects your amplitude envelope. And then we're going to have the amount, which is how much the filter envelope affects your sound. If you turn this to 0, not -10, but to 0, now it will not affect your cutoff frequency at all. So let's hear what that sounds like. You hear nothing, right? And we have a basic ADSR here, so you're just going to hear a very basic beep. So let's actually turn our filter, let's turn our amount up to make sure it affects our sound. And let's change our cutoff to make sure it actually goes somewhere. Now notice it immediately went to our cutoff. Let's take a second to get to our cutoff. Let's take 1 second to get to that cutoff we just set, which is 319 Hertz, which is actually kind of low. Let's raise that up to 1K. It might be a little bit less noticeable, but let's hear it. But so it took almost 1 second to get to our cutoff of 1K. Now if I put this up to something higher and I turn up the resonance, you might hear it more. Right? Because the resonance is going to exaggerate that cutoff frequency a little bit more. Let us hear it a little bit exaggerated, really. So I can turn this amount back down to 0 and watch, it's going to do nothing. It's at 0.1, so it's going to do a little bit of something, especially with the resonance cranked that high. But you can kind of get where I'm going with this. And now let's say you wanted to do the same thing with a high pass. You might want to go to the -10 because you might want your cutoff to change frequencies. So let's hear. It kind of opens up the filter as you're playing your notes. So it gives you a little bit more musicality, and it gives you that real control over your sound that you're looking for, whether it's the amplitude of your oscillator or it's the filter cutoff that you're controlling in real time. So before we jump into the last section here, which is the LFO, I want to ask you guys the question, which is your favorite module in Syntronik. I know, very basic question, but if you don't know what's in Syntronik, make sure you look it up right now. You're going to be winning 100 gear credits for doing so. All you have to do is put your IK username after your answer. So throw your answer in the chat box now. We're going to be giving away 100 gear credits at the very end of the episode. So make sure you like and subscribe. If you don't win today, you will have another option to win either next week, and Thursday we have another giveaway with Jesse, who does guitar lessons. If you're a guitar player, check it out. It's definitely worth it. He's an insane guitar player, and he's been using Amplitude 5 to show off all his tones. So it's really cool and very, very educational. So worth checking out. But let's go ahead and we're going to dive into our LFO section, which is going to be a whole endeavor in its own. But LFO is something that you should be familiar with at this point if you've been listening about oscillators. Okay, right, so you should really understand that, and what I mean by that is oscillator, right? Something that just goes from one value to another value back and forth. This is going to be a low frequency oscillator. So this is going to be an oscillator that you don't hear. It's going to be so low frequency that we don't hear it, but it's going to do something. It's going to oscillate. It's going to go from one value to another value. Now we can do that in a bunch of different ways. Now the fastest way for me to explain this to you would be for me to control my filter. So let's turn my filter all the way up, and notice you have pitch and you have pan that you can also control with your LFO. But in other synthesizers like the UNO Synth Pro, you have a modulation matrix. Sometimes in modular synthesizers, you'd be plugging things in to control say your filter or your pitch with your LFO. So this is all built into the control, but usually you'd have to route this stuff yourself. The UNO Synth Pro is actually really cool because it has a whole modulation matrix that makes it, think of a modular synth, a whole wall of synthesizers just all built into one, and all the cables are done inside digitally. but you have an analog sound, so you don't have to worry about losing any quality or anything like that. So let's take a look at this LFO. We're going to have it to a sine wave, which you guys should know what a sine wave is. It's on screen right here. If you don't, we'll jump into that in another lesson where we go even more basic stuff. But let's put BPM sync quarter note sine wave controlling our filter cutoff. So let's turn our cutoff filter or our cutoff for our filter to something crazy. Let's go to low pass. We'll go to 24 slope, and let's hear what that sounds like. Notice when I turn the filter amount up, it's going to allow our rate of quarter notes to change our cutoff. Think of somebody turning the knob in a quarter note rate. You can turn that BPM sync off and just go millisecond values or hertz values, really. A lot of people liked to think about that specific effect morphed with some stuff with formant for dubstep kind of sounds. Now, you can turn that filter up. If you turn your resonance up, you're going to hear that LFO kind of rate a little bit harder. Right, and it kind of makes it a little bit more exaggerated. Now, again, if you're losing some sound, you can add some more back on the drive. But that's the basics of the LFO is think about somebody just turning a knob. Now, that knob is controlling our filter, but let's have it control our pitch. And now I want to use an old school example of something that they taught me in school is think about we have a sine wave here, we have a triangle wave, we have a square wave, think on and off for square wave. This is how it hits that maximum value, like we're talking with ADSR. This sawtooth wave is really good for trying to exaggerate something like an alarm for something back in the day. Think of cartoons. Let's listen to how it sounds. Think Red Alert, Star Trek. Or even some old school video games, because they used a lot of basic oscillator sounds because they didn't have the space on some of the consoles to fit all that stuff in there, which is actually a really cool concept if you're not familiar with it. But that was our pitch being controlled by our LFO in a sawtooth style at quarter notes. So if we wanted to just have it go on and off from two different filter frequencies, let's do that with a square wave. So that hopefully makes some sense as to what an LFO does. Now you have something like random here, which you might not think, why would you use that? Or you might think, why would you use that? It's because it's going to give you some organic kind of life to your sound that you might not get by just throwing in a very specific value. So let's hear what it sounds like. Now, it doesn't sound that cool on the filter, but let's throw it on the pitch, and it's just going to go and range a little bit. Think of an old computer processing sound from the 90s. That's probably what they would exaggerate, is something bleeps and bloops going randomly, changing different pitches. And that is what you're doing with that LFO. So hopefully this kind of gives you a good grasp on what you're doing with your synthesizers. All of these knobs that you're turning are all the same on all of these different controls that you have. Synthesizers really stick to filter, oscillators, LFOs, and stuff like that. You do start to get into different effects controls, which we will dive into in future episodes, but hopefully this gives you a grasp on some sound design. We'll dive into some more sound design in the future with the UNO Synth Pro and some more audio examples of this. Remember, we just used this for really MIDI today and for an example of a morphing waveform, because these oscillators switch from one to the other just smoothly. It doesn't click like on an old school Moog. It would click from one waveform to the next. This will simultaneously switch from one to the next, to the next, to the next. It's really cool. So let's go ahead and we're going to give away this we're going to give away these 100 gear credits in the chat box. But I want to thank you guys again for watching. You're the reason why we do this every week. So make sure you guys like and subscribe. And we want to make sure You guys are getting the content that you want, so throw a comment in the box if you want to see something specific or unique. We've gotten some really good requests recently, and we're going to dive into some of that stuff very soon. But thank you guys again, and we will see you all next week.